When we breathe, we give off CO2, so imagine, there's a dynamic mixture of acetone, isoprene, and carbon dioxide that's constantly exchanging when when I get stressed or when I'm feeling, happiness or suspense in my state. And that dynamic sort of cocktail mixture that's in my breath is both an indicator of my state, but it's also something that, it's just the spaces around me have more information to contribute about how I'm feeling and can also be part of that solution in ways that I don't have to have things on my body, right? So I have sensors now that can measure CO2. You can watch my TED Talk. I have given examples. We brought people in when I was at Dolby and had them watching Free Solo, the Alex Honnold movie where they're climbing El Cap.
Stressful.
So carbon dioxide's heavier than air, so we could measure carbon dioxide from just tubes on the ground, and you could get the real-time differential of CO2 in there. And
were they scared throughout?
No. But I like to say we broadcast how we're feeling, right? And we do that wherever we are. And in this, you could look at the time series of carbon dioxide levels and be able to, know what was happening in the film or in the movie without actually having it annotated. You could tell where he summited, where he had to abandon his climb, where he hurt his ankle. Absolutely. There's another study, I forget who the authors are, and they've got different audiences watching Hunger Games. And different days, different people, you can tell exactly where Katniss's dress catches on fire. And, it's like we really are sort of, it's like digital exhaust of how we're feeling. But, and our thermals, we, radiate the things we're feeling. I'm very bullish on the power of, our eye in representing our cognitive load, our stressors.
Or our eye?
Our eye, yes, like the diameter.
Oh, our eye.
Yes.
Our eye. Sorry, literally our eyes.
Yes.
Our pupil size.
Yes.
Yeah.
I, back when I was a physiologist, I always, I've worked with a lot of species understanding information processing internally in cells, but also then I would very often use pupillometry as an indicator of, perceptual engagement and experience.
Yeah, bigger pupils mean more arousal, higher levels of alertness.
Yeah, more arousal, cognitive load, or, obviously lighting changes. But the thing that's changing from, 20 years ago, 15 years ago, it was very expensive to track the kind of resolution and data to, leverage all of those autonomic nervous system, deterministic responses, because those ones are deterministic and not probabilistic, right? Those are the ones that it's like the body's reacting even if the brain doesn't say anything about it.
Below conscious detection.
Yeah. And but today we can do that with we can do it right now with open source software on our laptops or our mobile devices, right? And every pair of smart glasses will be tracking this information when we wear them. So it becomes a channel of data. And, it may be an ambiguous signature in the sense that there's, changes in lighting, there's changes, am I aroused or am I...
Those can be adjusted for, right? Like if you can literally take a measurement, wear eyeglasses that are measuring pupil size. The eyeglasses could have a sensor that detects levels of illumination in the room at the level of my eyes. It could measure how dynamic that is. And we just make that the denominator in a fraction, right? And then we can just look at changes in pupil size as the numerator in that fraction, right? Yep. More or less.
You just have to have other sensors.
All you need to do is cancel. So as you walk from a shadowed area to a brighter area, sure, the pupil size changes, but then you can adjust for that change, right? You just like normalize for that. And you end up with an index of arousal.
Right.
Which is amazing. You could also use the index of illumination as a useful measure of, like, are you getting, compared to your vitamin D levels, to your levels of, maybe you need more illumination in order to get more arousal. Like, it could tell you all of this. It could literally say, hey, take a 5-minute walk outside to the left after work, and you will get your photon requirement for the day. This kind of thing, not just measuring steps. All this stuff is possible now. I just don't know why it's not being integrated into single devices more quickly. Because you'd love to also know that person's blood sugar instead of like drawing their blood, taking it down to like you think about with the resident that's been up for 13 hours because that's the standard in the field and they're making mistakes on a chart. It's like, I think at some point we're just going to go, I can't believe we used to do it that way. It's crazy.
Yeah, no, and it's a lot of the consumer devices and just computation we can do from, whether it's cameras or Exhalant or, other data in our environments that tell us about our physical state in some of these situations that you're talking about. A lot of why isn't it happening? A lot of the reasons are simply the regulatory process is antiquated and not up to keeping up with the acceleration of innovation that's happening. Getting things through the FDA, even if they're, deemed, in the same ballpark and supposed to move fast, with the regulatory costs and processes is really high. And, you end up many years, down the road from when the capability and the data and technology actually, should have arisen to be used in a hospital or to be used in a place where you actually have that kind of appreciation for the data, and use. The consumer grade devices for tracking of data of our biological processes are on par and in many cases surpassed the medical grade devices. And that's because they just have, but then they will have to bill what they do and what they're tracking in some way that is consumer, is not making the medical claims to allow them to be able to be, continue to move forward in those spaces. But there's no question that that's a big part of what can, holds back the availability of a lot of these devices and capabilities.
I'd like to take a quick break and acknowledge one of our sponsors, Function. Last year, I became a Function member after searching for the most comprehensive approach to lab testing. Function provides over 100 advanced lab tests that give you a key snapshot of your entire bodily health. This snapshot offers you with insights on your heart health, hormone health, immune functioning, nutrient levels, and much more. They've also recently added tests for toxins such as BPA exposure from harmful plastics and tests for PFASs or forever chemicals. Function not only provides testing of over 100 biomarkers key to your physical and mental health, but it also analyzes these results and provides insights from top doctors who are expert in the relevant areas. For example, in one of my first tests with Function, I learned that I had elevated levels of mercury in my blood. Function not only helped me detect that, but offered insights into how best to reduce my mercury levels, which included limiting my tuna consumption. I'd been eating a lot of tuna, while also making an effort to eat more leafy greens and supplementing with NAC and acetylcysteine, both of which can support glutathione production and detoxification. And I should say, by taking a second Function test, that approach worked. Comprehensive blood testing is vitally important. There's so many things related to your mental and physical health that can only be detected in a blood test. The problem is blood testing has always been very expensive and complicated. In contrast, I've been super impressed by Function's simplicity and at the level of cost. It is very affordable. As a consequence, I decided to join their scientific advisory board, and I'm thrilled that they're sponsoring the podcast. If you'd like to try Function, you can go to functionhealth.com/Huberman. Function currently has a wait list of over 250,000 people, but they're offering early access to Huberman podcast listeners. Again, that's functionhealth.com/Huberman to get early access to Function.
Okay, so I agree that we need more data and that there are a lot of different sensors out there that can measure blood glucose and sleep and temperature and breathing and all sorts of things, which raises the question of, are we going to need tons of sensors? I mean, are we going to be just wrapped in sensors as clothing? Are we going to be wearing 12 watches? What's this going to look like?
I'm an advocate for fewer things on, not having all this stuff on our bodies. There's so much we can get out of the computer vision side, from how, the cameras in our spaces and how they're supporting us in our rooms, the sensors on I brought up HVAC systems earlier. So now you've got effectively a digital twin that's and sensors that are tracking my metabolic rates just in my space. They're tracking carbon dioxide. They're tracking sound. You're getting context because of that. You're getting intelligence, and now you're able to start having more information from, what's happening in my environment. The same is true in my vehicle. You can tell whether I'm stressed or how I'm feeling just by the posture I have it sitting in my car, right? And you need AI. This is AI interpretation of data. But what's driving that posture might be coming from also an understanding of what else is happening in that environment. So it's suddenly this with contextual intelligence, AI-driven understanding of what's happening in that space that's driving, the state of me And how do I, I keep leaning to the side because I'm thinking about, the way I move and sit is, it's a proxy for what's actually happening inside me. And then you've also got data around me coming from my environment. What's happening, if I'm driving a car, or what's happening in my home, in my, in the weather, in not just threats that might be outside, in noise that's happening not inside the space, but things that give context to have more intelligence with the systems we have. So I'm a huge believer in we aren't anywhere until we have integration of those systems between the body, the local environment, and the external environment. And we're finally at a place where AI can help us start integrating that data. In terms of wearables, though, so obviously some of the big companies, we've got the watch we have on our hand has a lot of information that is very relevant to our bodies. The devices we put in our ears, you may not realize, but a dime-sized patch in your concha we can know heart rate, blood oxygen level, because of the electrical signature that your eye produces when it moves back and forth. We can know what you're looking at just from measuring a signature, measuring your electrooculogram in your ear. We can measure EEG, electroencephalograms. You can also get eye movements out of electroencephalograms, but you can get attention. You can know what people are attending to based on signatures in their ear. So our earbuds, that become sort of a window to our state. And you've got a number of companies working on that right now. So do we need to wear lots of different sensors? No. Do we need to have the sensors, the data we have, whether it's on our bodies or off our bodies, be able to, work together and not be proprietary to just one company, but to be able to integrate with other companies? That becomes really important. You need integrative systems so that the data they have can interact with the systems that surround you or surround my spaces or the mattress I'm sleeping on, right? Because you've had a lot of specialty of design come from different developers, and that's partly been a product of, again, the FDA and the regulatory pathways because of the cost of development. It tends to move companies towards specialization unless they're very large. Mm-hmm. But where we're at today is we're getting to a point where you're going to start seeing a lot of this data get integrated, I think. And by all means, hopefully we're not going to be wearing a lot of things on our bodies. I sure as heck won't. The more we put on our bodies, it affects our gait. It has ramifications in so many different ways. When I got here, I was talking to some of the people that work with you, and they're like, well, what wearables do you wear? And I actually don't wear many at all. And, I have worn rings, I've worn watches at different times. But for me, the importance is the point at which I get insights that, I am a big believer in as little on my body as possible when it comes to wearables. One interesting company that I think is worth mentioning is Python. And Python, again, they've got a form factor that's, like a Timex watch, or they're partnered with Timex, but they're measuring. Are you familiar with Python?
No.
Okay, so they're measuring psychomotor vigilance. So, really trying to understand, it's like a ENG, electroneuromodulation, and they're trying to understand fatigue and neural attentiveness in a way that is, continuous and useful for, say, high-risk operations or training, whether be it in sport. But what I like about it is it's actually trying to get at a higher level cognitive state from the biometrics or that you're measuring. And that to me is an really exciting direction, is when you're actually doing something that you could make a decision about how I engage in my work or how I engage in my training or my life based on that data about my cognitive state and how effective I'm going to be. Mm-hmm. And then I can start associating that data with the other data to have better decisions, better insights at a certain point in time. And that's really your digital twin.
It's interesting. Earlier you said you don't like the word gamification, but one thing that I think has really been effective in the sleep space has been this notion of a sleep score, where people aspire to get a high sleep score. And if they don't see that as a disparagement of them, but rather that they need to adjust their behavior. So it's not like, oh, I'm a terrible sleeper and I'll never be a good sleeper. It gives them something to aspire to on a night-by-night basis.
Yes.
And I feel like that's been pretty effective. When I say gamification, I don't necessarily mean competitive with others, but I mean encouraging of oneself, right? So I could imagine this showing up in other domains too, for wakeful states. Like, I had very few highly distracted, work bouts or something like that. Like, I'd love to know at the end of my day, I had 3 really solid work bouts of an hour each at least. That would feel good. It was like, oh, that was a day well spent, even if, I didn't accomplish what I wanted to in its entirety. Like, I put in some really good solid work. Right now, it's all very subjective. We know that gamification of steps was very effective as a public messaging, 10,000 steps a day. We now know you want to get somewhere exceeding 7,000 as the threshold. But if you think about it, we could have just as easily said, hey, you want to walk at a reasonable pace for you for 30 minutes per day. But somehow the counting steps thing was more effective, because people I know who are not fanatic about exercise at all will tell me, I make sure I get my 11,000 steps per day. Like, people tell me this. I'm like, oh, okay. Like, so apparently it's a meaningful thing for people. So I think quantification of performance creates this aspirational state. So I think that can be very useful.
Data and understanding the quantification that you're working towards is really important. Those are, summary statistics effectively that maybe they're good on some level to aim for. If it means that people move more, all for it, right? And it's something that if I didn't move as much before and I didn't get up and I didn't do something, then, and this is making me do it, that's awesome, or that's great. But it's also great when now through like a computer vision app, I can understand it's not just 10,000 steps, but maybe there's, a small battery of things I'm trying to perform against that are helping shape me neurally with the feedback and the targets that I'm getting, so that there's more nuance towards achieving the goal I'm aiming for, which is what I'm all about from a neuroplasticity perspective. So I just don't like the word gamification. I believe everything should be fun, or everything training can be fun and gamified in some ways. Again, like, my life has been predominantly in industry, but I've always, I love teaching, and I've always been at Stanford to, really. There, I try to. It's how do I use technology and merge it with the human system in a way that does help optimize learning and training in a way that is from a sort of neural circuit first perspective. How do we think about the neural system and use this more enjoyable, understandable target to engage with it? One of my favorite examples, though, is there was a period, it was right around 2018, 2020, and from 2018 to 2020 into the pandemic, where, there became, the students I noticed had a much more, there were a lot of projects. Their final project, they can build whatever they want. And, they've had to do projects where they build brain-computer interfaces. They've had to build projects in VR. They've had to build AR projects. They've had to build projects that, use any sort of input device. They have to use different sensor-driven input devices, and that's all part of what they develop. And around 2018, 2020, I started to see almost every project had a wellness component to it, which I loved. I thought that was, and it was a very notable shift in like the student body, and maybe you've seen that too. But I still got this, like, one of my favorite games to date was this VR game where I'm, in a morgue, I wake up, I've got to solve an escape room, I've got zombies that are coming out of me, and they're climbing out of the morgue, and they're getting closer, and there's people breathing on my neck, and they're like, and everything. And it's a wellness app. Go figure. It was their idea of, look, this is what I feel like. I've got to, because I'm also measuring my breath and heart rate. And I've got to keep those biological signatures. Like, everything about how the zombies in solving my escape room problems, they're going to get closer to me if my breath rate goes up, if my heart rate goes up. I've got to keep...
So it was about stress control, basically.
Exactly, yes. But it was in that environment, and it was, realized for them how they felt. But yeah, and you can do it in much simpler ways. But at least I'm a huge fan of how do we use the right quantification to develop the right habits, the right skills, the right acuity or resolution in a domain we might not, or an area where we might not be able to break it into the pieces we need, but it's going to help us get there, because my brain actually needs to now learn to understand that different, that sophistication.
Yeah, it's clear to me that in the health space, giving people information that scares them is great for getting them to not do things, but it's very difficult to scare people into doing the right things. You need to incentivize people to do the right things by making it engaging and fun and quantifiable. And, I like the example of the zombie game. Okay, so fortunately, we won't have to wear dozens of sensors. They'll be more integrated over time.
I'm happy to walk through a cheat sheet later after, for building out like a computer vision app, if for quantifying some of these more personalized domain related things that people might want to do. If
that would be
useful.
Awesome. Yeah, and then we can post a link to it in the show note captions, because I think
good.
that the example you gave of creating an app that can analyze swimming performance, running gait, focused work bouts, I think that's really intriguing to a lot of people. But I think at least for me, there's a gap there between hearing about it, thinking it's really cool, and how to implement. So I'd certainly appreciate it. I know the audience would too.
And
that's very generous of you. Thank you.
Yes, absolutely. And we're in an era where all you hear about is AI and AI tools. And there are tools that absolutely accelerate our capabilities as humans. But, we gave the examples of talking about some of the LLMs. I mean, I sat next to we went to Cal. I was at a film premiere, and I was sitting there. I was sitting next to a few students who happened to be from Berkeley, and they said to me, they were computer science students and double engineering. And one of them, when he knew what I talk about or care about, he's like, I'm really worried my peer group, like my peers, can't start a paper without ChatGPT. And it was a truth, but it was also a concern. So they understand the implications of what's happening. And, that's on one level. We're in an era of agents everywhere. And, I think Reid has said that there's, a number of people have said, we'll be using AI agents for everything at work in the next 5 years. And some of those things we need to use. Agents will accelerate. They will accelerate capability. They will accelerate short-term revenue, but they also will diminish workforce cognitive skill. And as a user of agents in any environment, as an owner of companies employing agents, you have to think hard about what the near-term and long-term ramifications. Doesn't mean you don't use your agents in places where you need to, but you need to, without the germane cognitive load, there is a different dependence now that you have to have down the road, but also you have to think about how do you engage with the right competence to keep your humans that are engaged with developing their cognitive skills and their germane their mental schemas to be able to support your systems down the road.
Let's talk more about digital twins.
Sure.
I don't think this concept has really landed squarely in people's minds as like a specific thing. I think people hear AI, they know what AI is more or less. They hear about a smartphone, they obviously know what a smartphone is. Everyone uses one, it seems. But what is a digital twin? I think when people hear the word twin, they think it's a twin of us. Earlier, you pointed out that's not necessarily the case. It can be a useful tool for some area of our life, but it's not a replica of us, correct?
Not at all in the ways that I think are most relevant. Maybe, there are some, side cases that think about that. And so, first, two things to think about. One, when I talk about digital twins to companies and such, I like to frame it on how it's being used, how the immediacy of the data from the digital twin. So let's go back 50 years. an example of a digital twin that we still use, air traffic controllers. When an air traffic controller sits down and looks at a screen, they're not looking at a spreadsheet. They're looking at a digitization of information about physical objects that is meant to give them fast reaction times, make them understand the landscape as effectively as possible. We would call that situational awareness. I've got to take in data about the environment around me, and I've got to be able to action on it as rapidly, as quickly as possible to make the right decisions that mitigate any potential, things that are determined to be problems or risks, right? And so that's what you're trying to engage a human system. The visualization of that data is important, or it doesn't have to be visualization, the interpretation of it, right? And it's not the raw data. It's how is that data, represented? You want the key information in a way that the salient, most important information, in this case, about planes, is able to be acted on by that human or even autonomous system, right?
Could you give me an example where, in like a more typical home environment?
We're both into reefing, and I built an aquacultured reef in my kitchen partly because I have a child and I wanted her to understand. I love it myself, so don't get that wrong. It wasn't just ultra, but to understand sort of the fragility of the ecosystems that happen in the ocean and things we need to worry about, care about, and all. And initially when I started, and maybe this is not something you encountered, but when you build a reef or a reef tank and do saltwater fish, you're a couple of things. You're doing chemical measurements by hand, usually, weekly, biweekly. There's a whole, like 10 different chemicals that you're measuring. And I would have my daughter doing that so that she would do the science part of it. And you're trying to, the ranges, the tolerances you have, and you're also observing this ecosystem and looking for problems. And by the time you see a problem, you're reacting to that problem. And I can tell you, it was very unsuccessful. I mean, there's lots of error and noise in human measurements. You don't have the right resolution of measurements. When resolution, I mean, I'm every few days is not enough to track a problem. You also have the issue of, you're reactive instead of being proactive. It's just you're not sensing things that the point at which it's visible to you, it's probably too late to do anything about it. So if you look at my fish tank right now or my reef tank right now, I have a number of digital sensors in it. I have dashboards. I can track a huge chemical assay that is tracked in real time so that I can go back and look at the data. I can understand, I can see, there was a water change there, or the roadie tank, I can tell what's happening by looking at the data. I have, and this, you've got the spectrum of your lights is on a cycle of effect that's representative of the environment that the corals you're aquaculturing would, that their systems, their deterministic systems are looking for, right? And so you've built this ecosystem that when I look at my dashboards, I have a digital twin of that system. And my tank is very stable. My tank knows what's wrong, what's happening. I can look at the data and understand that an event happened somewhere that could have been mitigated, or I can understand that something's wrong quickly before it even shows up.
It's amazing. I mean, I think for people who aren't into reefing,
yes.
You might ask, I know people and multiple people in my life are soon to have kids. Most everybody nowadays has a camera on the sleeping environment of their kids, so that if their kid wakes up in the middle of the night, they can see it, they can hear it. So camera and microphone. Do you think we're either have now or soon will have AI tools that will help us better understand the health status of infants? Like, parents learn intuitively over time based on diaper changes, based on all sorts of things, cries, frequency of illnesses, et cetera, and how well their kids are doing before kids can communicate that. Do you think AI can help parents be better parents by giving real-time feedback on the health information of their kids, not just if they're awake or asleep or if they're in some sort of trouble, but really help us adjust our care of our young, like what's more important for our species than, supporting the growth of our next generation?
No, absolutely. But I'd even more on the biological side. I mean, so think about digital twins. And I'll get to babies in a moment, but just if you've ever bought a plane ticket, which any of us have today, that's a very sophisticated digital twin. Not the air traffic controllers looking at planes, but the pricing models for what data is going into driving that price in real time, right? You might be trying to buy a ticket and you go back an hour later or half hour later and it's like double, or maybe it's gone up. And that's because it's using constant data from environments, from things happening in the world, from geopolitical issues, from things happening in the market that's driving that price. And that is very much an AI-driven digital twin that's driving, the sort of value of that ticket. And so there are places where we use digital twins. So that would be sort of the example of something that's affecting our lives, but we don't think about it as a digital twin, but it is a digital twin. Mm-hmm. And then you think about a different example where you've got a whole sandbox model. The NFL might have a digital twin of every player that's in the NFL, right? They know the data, they're tracking that information, they know how people are going to perform many times. What do they care about? They want to anticipate if someone might be, high risk for an injury so that they, can mitigate it.
They're using those kind of data?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Interesting. And I think the word twin is the misleading part. I feel like digital twin, I feel like soon that nomenclature needs to be replaced because people hear twin, they think a duplicate of yourself.
Yes.
I feel like these are
well, it's a duplicate of relevant data and information about yourself, but not just trying to, what's the purpose in emulating myself? It's to emulate so imagine me as a physical system. I'm going to digitize some of that data. Right. And whatever, data I have, it's how that data I interact with it to make intelligent insights and feedback loops in the digital environment about how that physical system is going to behave. Right?
Okay. So it's a digital representative.
Yes.
More than a digital twin.
Yes.
I think I'm not trying to
there
split
are many digital twins in any digital twin. So even, you've got data, you live with lots of digital, I think the digital twin, whatever nomenclature would say is a digital twin, but I like a digital representative, and it's informing some aspect of decision making, and it's many feedback. So I'm digitizing different things. I'm, and in that situational awareness model, can I give a quick example? So imagine I can digitize an environment, right? I can digitize the space we're in right now, and would that be a digital twin? So first, in situational awareness, there's the state of, okay, so what's the sort of sensor, limitations, the acuity of the data I've actually brought in, okay? So that's like perception, same with our sensory systems. And then there's comprehension. So comprehension would be like, okay, that's a table, that's a chair, that's a person. Now I'm in those sort of semantic units of relevance that the digitization takes. Then there's the insight. So what's happening in that environment? What do I do with that? What is, and that's where things get interesting. And that's where a lot of, I think the future of AI products is, because then it's the feedback loops of what's happening with those, that input and that data. And it becomes interesting and important when you start having multiple layers of relevant data that are interacting that can give you the right insights about what's happening, what to anticipate, and, in that space. But that's all about our situational awareness and intelligence in that environment.
Yeah, I can see where these technologies could take us. I think for the general public right now, AI is super scary because we hear most about AI developing its own forms of intelligence that turn on us. Mm-hmm. I think people are gradually getting on board the idea that AI can be very useful. We have digital representatives already out there for us in these different domains.
Absolutely.
And I think being able to customize them for our unique challenges and our unique goals is really what's most exciting to me.
I love that because, I think what I was trying to say is exactly what you said. Look, they are out there, and these are effectively digital twins. Every company you're interacting with social media has effectively a digital twin of you in some place. It's not to emulate your body, but it's to emulate your behaviors. So in those spaces, or you're using tools that are have digital twins for things you do in your daily life. So the question is, how do we harness that for our success, for individual success, for understanding and agency of what that can mean for you. If the NFL is using it for a player, you can use it as an athlete, meaning as an athlete at any level, right? And it's that digitization of information that can feed you. For my baby, you can better understand a great deal about how they're successful or what isn't successful about them. And, some of it, not your baby's always successful, I don't want to say, but what is maybe not, working well for them, the things that, but I would tend to say the exciting places about digital twins come in, and really once you start integrating the data from different places that tell us about the success of our systems, and those are anchored with actual successes, right? I think you used an example of your mattress and sleep, or even like one I liked was I had 3 good, very focused work sessions. You may have used different words, Andy. But the idea is, okay, you've had those, but it's when you can correlate it with other systems and other outputs that it becomes powerful. That's the way a digital representative or a digital twin becomes more useful, is thinking about not the resolution of the data, where the data source, where the data is coming from, meaning whether is it biometric data, is it environmental data, is it the context of the state of what else was happening during those work sessions, and how is that something that I don't have to think about, but AI can help me understand where I'm successful and what else drove that success or what drove that state. Because it's not just my success, it's intelligence. I like to call it situational intelligence, is sort of the overarching goal that we want to have. And that involves, my body and systems having situational awareness, but it's really, a lot of integration of data that, AI is very powerful for thinking about how does it optimize and give us the insights. It doesn't have to just have systems behave, but it can give us the insights of how effectively we can act in those environments.
Yeah, I think of AI as being able to see what we can't see.
Yes.
So for instance, if I had some sort of AI representative that paid attention to my work environment and to my ability to focus as I'm trying to do focused work, and it turned out, obviously I'm making this up, but it turned out that every time my air conditioner clicked over to silent or back to on, that it would break my focus for the next 10 minutes.
Yes.
And I wasn't aware of that. And by the way, this, for people listening, this is entirely plausible, because so many of our states of mind are triggered by cues that we're just fundamentally unaware of. Or that it's always at the 35-minute mark that my eyes start to have to reread words or lines because somehow my attention is drifting, or that it's paragraphs of longer than a certain length. It's a near infinite space for us to explore on our own, but for AI to explore it, it's straightforward.
Right.
And so it can see through our cognitive blind spots and our functional blind spots. I think of where people pay a lot of money right now to get information to get around their blind spots are things like when you have a pain and you don't know what it is, you go to this thing called a doctor. Or when you have a problem and you don't know how to sort it out, you might talk to a therapist, right? People pay a lot of money for that. I'm not saying AI should replace all of that, but I do think AI can see things that we can't see.
2 examples to your point, which I love. The reading, potentially there's a point at which you're experiencing fatigue and you want to, ideally, much like the fish tank, you want to be not reactive, you want to be proactive. You want to mitigate it, stop, or you could have, your devices can have that integration of data and respond to give you feedback when either your mental acuity, your vigilance, or your just effectiveness has waned, right? But also on the level of health, we know AI is, huge for identifying a lot of different pathologies out of, data that as humans, we're just not that good at discerning. Our voice, in the last 10 years, we've become much more aware of the different pathologies that are can be discerned from AI assessments of our speech, and not what we say, but how we say it.
Yeah, there's a lab up at the University of Washington. I think it's Sam Golden's lab, who's working on some really impressive algorithms to analyze speech patterns as a way to predict suicidality.
Oh, interesting.
And to great success, where people don't realize that they're drifting in that direction.
Yeah.
And phones can potentially warn people,
Yes.
warn themselves, right? That they're drifting in a particular direction. People who have cycles of depression or mania can know whether or not they're drifting into that. That can be extremely useful. They can discern who else gets that information. I think and it's all based on tonality at different times of day, stuff that even in a close relationship with a therapist over many years, they might not be able to detect if the person becomes reclusive or something of that sort.
Absolutely. I mean, neurodegeneration, it shows up in, short assessment of how people speak. They've definitely been able to show potential likelihood of psychosis, and that's with syntactic completion and how people read paragraphs. Neural degeneration, though, things like Alzheimer's show up in speech because of the linguistic cues can show up, but sometimes 10 years before a typical clinical symptom would show up that would be identified. And what I think is important for people to realize is it's not someone saying, I don't remember. It's nothing like that. It's not those cues that you think are actually relevant. It's more like an individual says something like that, what I just did, which was I purposely stuttered. I started a word again, right? And it's what we might call a stutter in how we're speaking, sometimes duration of spaces between starting one sentence to the next. These are things that as humans we've adapted to not pick up on because it makes us ineffective in communication but an algorithm can do so very well. Diabetes, heart disease, both show up in voice. Diabetes shows up because you can pick up on dehydration in the voice. Much as, again, I'm a sound person in my heart and my past, and if you look at the spectrum of sound, you're going to see changes that show up. There are very consistent things in a voice that show up with dehydration in the spectral, salience, as well as with heart disease. You get sort of flutter that shows up. It's a proxy for things happening inside your body, with problems, cardiovascular issues, but you're going to see them as certain like modulatory fluctuations in certain frequency bands, and again. We don't walk around as a partner or a spouse or a child, caretaking our parents and listening for like the 4 kilohertz modulation, but an algorithm can. And all of these are places where you can identify something that is potentially mitigate something proactively before there's a problem. And especially with like neurodegeneration, we're really just getting to a place where there's pharmacological opportunities to slow something down, and you want to find that as quick as possible. So where do you want to have that input so that you can do something about it? You asked me about the babies, like before the type of coughs we have tell us a lot about different pathologies. So for a baby, their cry, if I'm thinking, you asked me about a digital twin, where would I be most interested in using that information if I had, children, or, I do have a child, but from, in the sort of lowest touch, most opportunity, it's to identify potential, pathologies or issues early based on, the natural sounds and the natural utterances and that are happening to understand if there is something that, there's a way it could be helped. It could be, you could proactively make something much better.
Let's talk about you.
Oh boy.
And how you got into all of this stuff, because you're highly unusual in the neuroscience space. I recall when we were graduate students, when you were working on auditory perception and physiology, and then years later, now you're involved in AI, neuroplasticity, you were at Dolby. What is to you the most interesting question that's driving all of this? Like what guides your choices about what to work on?
Human technology intersection and perception is my core, right? I say perception, but the world is data, and how our brains take in the data that we consume to optimize how we experience the world is what I care about across all of what I've spent my time doing. And for me, technology is such a huge part of that it is. I like to innovate, I like to build things, but I also like to think about how do we improve human performance. core to improving human performance is understanding how we're different, not just how we're similar, but the nuances of how our brains are shaped and how they're influenced. And thus why I care. I've spent so much time in neuroplasticity, and it is at the intersection of everything is how are we changing and how do we harness that? How do we make it something that we have agency over, whether it's from the technologies we build and we innovate to the point of, I want to feel better. I want to be successful. I don't want that to be something left to surprise me, right? Mm-hmm. So you asked me, how did I get there? One thing so I was violinist back in the day. I'm still a violinist, and music's a part of my life. But I was studying music and engineering when I was an undergrad. And I think we alluded to the fact I have absolute pitch. And absolute pitch is, for anyone that doesn't know, it's not anything that means I always sing in tune. What it means is I hear the world I hear sound like people see color. Okay. And I can't turn it off, really. I can kind of push it back.
Wait, sorry. Don't we all hear sound like we see? I mean, I hear sounds and I see colors. Could you clarify what you mean?
So when you walk down the street, your brain is going, that's red, that's black, that's blue, that's green. My brain's going, that's an A, that's a B, that's a G, that's an
I
F,
see.
right?
You're categorizing.
There's a categorical perception about it. And because of the nature of, I think, my exposure to sound in my life, I also know what frequency it is, right? So I can say that's 350 hertz, or that's 400 hertz, or that's 442 hertz, and it has different applications. I mean, I can transcribe a jazz solo when I listen to it. That's a great party trick, but it doesn't mean that it's not necessarily a good thing for a musician, right? You know as well as I do that categorical perception is we all have different forms of it. Usually for speech and language, like units of vowels or phonetic units especially vowels you can hear many different versions of an E and still hear it as an E. And that's what we would call categorical perception. And my brain does the same thing for a sort of set of frequencies to hear it as an A. And that can be good at times, but when you're actually a musician, there's a lot more subtlety that goes into how you play with other people and what key you're in, or what the details. Like if you ask me to sing Happy Birthday, I'm always going to sing it in the key of G if I am left to my own devices, and I will get you there somehow if we start somewhere else. Mm-hmm. So what happened to me when I was in music school, when I was in conservatory and also engineering school is I was taking two things happened. I knew that I had to override my brain because it was not allowing me the subtlety I wanted to play my Shostakovich or play my chamber music in the ways that I was having to work too hard to override what these sort of categories of sounds I was hearing. So I started playing early music, Baroque music. For anyone, I think I said earlier, A is a social construct. Today, we typically, as a standard, A is 440 hertz. If you go back to like the 1700s, A was 415 hertz in the Baroque era. And 415 hertz is effectively a G sharp. So it's the difference between ah and ah. Okay. And what would happen to me when I was trying to override this is I was playing in an early music ensemble, and I would tune my violin up, and I would see A on the page, and I'd hear G sharp in my brain. And it was completely, I was terrible. I was like always, it was really hard for my brain to override. And brass and wind players do this all the time. It's like transposition, and they modulate to the key that they're in, and their brains have evolved, through their training in neuroplasticity to be able to not have the same sort of experience I had. Anyhow, long story long, I was also taking a neuroscience course. In this neuroscience course, we were reading papers about sort of different map making and neuroplasticity. And I read this paper by a professor at Stanford named Eric Knudsen. And Eric Knudsen did these amazing he did a lot of seminal work for how we understand the auditory pathways, as well as how we form multisensory objects and the way the brain integrates cells data across our modalities, meaning sight and sound. But in this paper, what he was doing was he had identified cells in the brain that optimally responded. Their receptive fields, receptive field being that sort of like in all of that giant data set of the world, it's that, it's the set of data that optimally causes that cell to respond. And for these cells, they cared about a particular location in auditory and visual space, which, frankly, for mammals, we don't have the same sort of like cells because we can move our eyes back and forth in our sockets, unlike owls. And he studied owls. And owls have a very hardwired map of auditory visual space.
On the other hand, if I hear click off to my right, I turn my head to the right.
You turn your head. It triggers a different, vestibular ocular response that moves, all of that, yes. But in this case, he had these beautiful hardwired maps of auditory visual space. And then he would rear and raise these owls with prism glasses that effectively shifted their visual system by 15 degrees. And then he would put them, key to developing neuroplasticity, he would put them in high, important, high, not stress, but let's say situations where they had to do something critical to their survival or their well-being. And so they would hunt and they would feed and do things like that with the this 15-degree shift. And consequently, he saw the cells, the auditory neurons, he saw their dendrites realign to the now 15-degree visually shifted cells. And it was this realization that they developed a secondary map that was now aligned with the 15-degree shift of the prism glasses, as well as their original map was super interesting for understanding how our brains integrate data and the feedback and neuroplasticity. So I go back to my Baroque violin where I'm always out of tune, and I'm tuning up my Baroque violin, and I realized I had developed absolute pitch at A415. So I developed a secondary absolute pitch map. And then I would go play Shostakovich right after at A440, and I had that map. And I have nothing in between, but I could modulate between the two. And that's like the point at which I said, I think I just, my brain is a little weird, and I just did something that I need to go better understand. So that's how I ended up here as a neuroscientist.
I know Eric's work really well. Our labs were next door.
Yes,
our offices were next
wonderful.
door. He's retired now, but
he knows. I told him the story.
he's wonderful. I think one of my favorite things about those studies, I think people will find interesting, is that if an animal, human or owl, has a displacement in the world, something's different, something changes and you need to adjust to it. It could be like new information coming to you that you need to learn in order to perform your sport correctly, or to perform well in class, or an emotionally challenging situation that you need to adjust to. All of that can happen, but it happens much, much faster if your life depends on it.
Yes.
And we kind of intuitively know this, but one of my favorite things about his work is where he said, okay, well, yeah, these owls can adjust to the prism shift. Their maps in the brain can change, but they sure as heck form much faster if you say, hey, in order to eat, in other words, in order to survive, these maps have to change. And I like that study so much because, we hear all the time, it takes 29 days to form a new habit, or it takes 50 days to form a new habit, or whatever it is. Actually, you can form a new habit as quickly as is necessary to form that new habit. And so the limits on neuroplasticity are really set by how critical it is.
Yeah.
And, of course, if you put a gun to my head right now and you said, okay, remap your auditory world. I mean, there are limits at the other end too. I mean, I can't do that quickly. But I think it's a reminder to me anyway, and thank you for bringing up Eric's work. It's a reminder to me that neuroplasticity is always in reach. If the incentives are high enough, we can do it.
Yeah.
And so I think with AI, it's going to be very interesting, or with technology generally, our ability to form these new maps of experience, at least with smartphones, has been pretty gradual. I really see 2010 as kind of the beginning of the smartphone. And then now by 2025, we're in a place where most everyone, young and old, has integrated this new technology. I think AI is coming at us very fast, and it's unclear what form it's coming at us and where. And as you said, it's already here. And I think we will adapt.
Yeah.
For sure. We'll form the necessary maps. I think being very conscious of which maps we're are changing is so key. I mean, I think we're still doing a lot of cleanup of the kind of detrimental aspects of smartphones.
Well,
short wavelength light late at night,
Absolutely.
being in contact with so many people all the time, maybe not so good. I mean, I think what scares people, certainly me, is the idea that we're going to be doing a lot of error correction over the next 30 years because we're going so fast with technology, because maps can change really, really fast.
Well, they do change. Sam Altman had I saw him say this, and I actually thought it was a really good description. It's like, Gen X, or, there's a group that is using AI as a tool that's sort of novel, interesting. Then you've got a different millennials are using it as, a search algorithm, and maybe that's even Gen X, but it's a little more deeply integrated. But then you go back to younger generations, and it's an operating system, and it already is. And that has major changes in neural structure for how, not just maps, but also neural processes for how we deal with information, how we learn. The idea that we are very plastic under pressure, absolutely. And that's where it gets interesting to talk about different species too. I mean, we're talking about owls, and that was under pressure, but what is successful human performance in training and all of these things? It's to make those probabilistic situations more deterministic, right? That's when if you're training as an athlete, you're really trying to not have to think and to have the fastest reaction time to very complex behaviors given complex stimuli, complex situations and contexts. But that situational awareness or physical behavior in those environments, you want that as fast as possible with as little cognitive load as possible. And, it's like that execution is critical. You love looking across species, so do I. And looking for these ways where, a brain is changing, or you've got a species that can do something that is absolutely not what you would predict, or it's incredible. And it's, how it can evade a predator, how it can find a target, find a mate. And, it's doing things that are critical to it being able to survive, much as you said. Like, if I make it something that is absolutely necessary for success, it's going to do it. One of my favorite examples is a particular moth that bats predate on, echolocating bats. And frankly, echolocating bats are sort of nature's engineered, amazing predatory species. Their brains, when you look at them, are just incredible. They have huge amounts of their brain just dedicated to what's called a FM, constant frequency FM sort of sweep. Some of the bats, elicit a call that's sort of like, ooh, ooh, but really high.
So we can't hear it. Yeah.
Yes.
And what does that do for them?
It's doing two things. One, that constant frequency portion is allowing them to sort of track the Doppler in a moving object. So, and they're even so. It's such clever and sophisticated. They're not changing. They're changing subtly what frequencies they elicit the call at, so that it always comes back in the same frequency range, because that's where their heightened sensitivity is. Mm-hmm. So otherwise, so they're modifying their vocal cords to make sure that the call comes back in the same range, and then they're tracking how much they've had to modify the call.
Just so that people are on board. Yeah, bats echolocate.
Yeah.
Like that, they're sending out sound, and they can measure distance, and they can essentially see in their mind's eye. They can sense distance, they can sense speed of objects, they can sense shape of objects by virtue of sounds being sent out and coming back.
Absolutely.
And they're shaping the sounds going out differently so that they can look at multiple objects simultaneously.
But also, they're shaping the sounds they send out so that whatever comes back is in their optimal neural range, so that they don't have to go through more neuroplasticity, that they already have circuits that are really dedicated to these certain frequency ranges. And so they send it out, and then they're keeping track of the deltas. They're keeping track of how much they've had to change it. And that's what's tells them the speed. So that constant frequency is a lot like, the ambulance sound going by. That's the compression of sound waves that you hear as a woo when things move past you at speed. That's the Doppler effect. And then it has usually a really fast FM frequency modulated sweep. And that lets me take kind of an imprint of, so one's telling me the speed of the object, another one's telling me sort of what the surface structure looks like, right? That FM sweep lets me get, a sonic imprint of what's there, so I can tell topography. I can tell if there's a moth on a hard surface, right? So what's beautiful about other species is you've got a little moth and you've got nature's predatory marvel. And 80% of the time that moth gets away.
How?
Multiple things. I call it almost an acoustic arms race that's happening between the two, and there's a lot of acoustic subterfuge between the moth. But there's also beautiful deterministic responses that they have. And so first, deterministic behaviors, again, be it an athlete, be it effectiveness, being fast, quick in making good decisions that get you the right answer are always important. So, moths have just a few neurons. When that echolocating bat is flying, at a certain point, when those neurons start firing, they will start, they'll start flying in more of a random pattern. You'll see the same thing with seals when there are great white sharks around, right? It's decreasing the probability that, it's easy for them to continue to track you. So they'll fly in a random pattern, and then when their neurons saturate, those calls get close enough, the moth will drop to the ground, with the idea that, assuming we don't live in cities, in a natural world, the ground is, wheat, grass. It's a difficult environment for an echolocating bat to locate you, right? So that is just a deterministic behavior that will happen regardless. But then the interesting part is their body is reflecting meta-reflectors effectively, so that the bat may put out its call and it deflects the energy of the call away from its body. So you're deflecting it away from critical areas. And this is all like happening, and that's the changes in the physical body are interesting, but then it's the behavioral differences, they're really key, right? It's how fast does that moth react? If it has to question, or if it were cognitively responsive instead of being deterministic in its behavior, it wouldn't escape, right? But it gets away.
Yeah, I've never thought about bats and moths. I never got the insect. I was about to say I never got the insect bug. No pun intended. I never got the insect bug because I don't think of things in the auditory domain. I think of things in the visual domain. And some insects are very visual, but it's good for me to think about that. One of my favorite people, although I never met him, was Oliver Sacks, like the neurologist and writer. And he claimed to have spent a lot of time just sitting in a chair and trying to imagine what life would be like as a bat, as a way to enhance his clinical abilities with patients suffering from different neurologic disorders.
Huh.
So when he would interact with somebody with Parkinson's or with severe autism or with Lockton syndrome or any number of different deficits of the nervous system, he would he felt that he could go into their mind a bit to understand what their experience was like. He could empathize with them, and that would make him more effective at treating them. And he certainly was very effective at storing out their experience in ways that brought about a lot of compassion and understanding. Like, he never presented a neural condition in a way that made you feel sorry for the person. Mm-hmm. It was always the opposite. And I should point out, I'm not trying to be politically correct here, but when I say autistic, I meant the patients he worked with were severely autistic to the point of, never being able to take care of themselves. We're not talking about along a spectrum. We're talking about the far end of the spectrum of needing assisted living their entire lives and being sensory, from a sensory standpoint, extremely sensitive, couldn't go out in public, that kind of thing. Now, we're not talking about people that are functioning with autism. So, apparently thinking in the auditory domain was useful for him, so I should probably do that. So I have one final question for you, which is, what's really two questions. First question, why did you sing to spiders? And second, what does that tell us about spider webs? Because I confess I know the answers to these questions, but I was absolutely blown away to learn what spider webs are actually for. And you singing to spiders reveals what they're for. So why did you sing to spiders?
Two things. And you can watch me sing to a spider on a TED Talk I gave a few years ago.
We'll put a link
years
to
back.
it.
Okay. And So maybe this comes back to, I have absolute pitch, so I know what frequencies I'm singing. But I also recognize by having absolute pitch, I know my brain is just a little different. Again, what you asked me, what threads drive me, it's always been, we do experience the world differently. And I believe that our success, everyone's success, and the success of our growth as humans is partly dependent on how we use technology to help, improve and optimize each of us with the different variables we need, right? So different species and how they respond to sound is very interesting to me. And as much as I know, Andy, you look at how different species respond to color and to information in the world, be it cuttlefish or such. I have jellyfish too, and I can see how they, their pulsing rates change with their photoreceptors when they, with different light colors. It's very obvious that some clearly make, that they are when they're under stress versus when they're in a more calming state. And so it's like understanding the stimuli in our world that shape us. Those changes is a huge part of being human, in my perspective. In this case, this happens to be an orb spider, the one I sing to. And when I hit about 880 hertz, you will see the spider kind of dances. But what this particular species, and not all spiders will do this, is predated on by echolocating bats and birds, which makes sense that then, it tunes its web effectively. And the orb weavers are all over California. They show up a lot around Thanksgiving. If you are October, November, for anyone that's on the, out here on the West Coast. They're not bad spiders. They are not spiders you need to get rid of. They're totally happy spiders. There are some, that maybe you should worry about more. Anyhow, they tune their webs to resonate like a violin. And when, you'll see it as I hit a certain frequency, it'll effectively tell me to go away. And it's a pretty interesting sort of deterministic response. Other insects do different things. The one kind of funny for that was when my daughter was, I think at the time she was about 2.5 or 3, and she kind of adopted asking me when we would see spiders if it was the kind we should sing to or the kind we shouldn't touch. Wait, so those were the two classes.
So amazing. So if I understand correctly, these orb spiders use their web more or less as an instrument to detect certain sound frequencies in their environment.
Resonances, absolutely.
So that they can respond appropriately.
Yeah.
Either by raising their legs to protect themselves or to attack or whatever it is. Yeah. The spider web is a functional thing, not just for catching prey. It's a detection device also. And we know that because when prey are caught in a spider web, they wiggle and then the spider goes over to it and wraps it and eats it. But the idea that it would be tuned to particular frequencies is really wild.
Yeah, not just any vibration, right? There's the idea that there's any vibration. I know I've got food somewhere, I should go to that food source. But instead it's something that if I experience a threat or something, I'm going to behave. And that is a more selective, response that I've tuned it towards.
It's so interesting because if I just transfer it to the visual domain, it's like, yeah, of course, like if an animal, including us, sees something like a looming object coming at us closer to dark, our immediate response is to either freeze or flee. Like that's just what we do. The looming response is one of the most fundamental responses, but that's in the visual domain. So the fact that there would be auditory cues that would bring about what you said, sort of deterministic responses seems very real. I feel like the wail of somebody in pain evokes a certain response. Yesterday there was a lot of noise outside my window at night, and there was a moment where I couldn't tell were these shouts of glee or shouts of fear. And I can't tune it. And then I heard this kind of high pitch fluttering that came after the scream, and I realized these were kids playing in the alley outside my house. And I went and looked. And I was like, oh, yeah, they're definitely playing. But I knew even before I went and looked, based on the kind of the flutter of sound that came after the shriek. It was like, and then it was like I can't reproduce the sound at that high frequency.
But that's super.
So the idea that this would be true all the time is super interesting. We just don't tend to focus just on our hearing unless, of course, somebody's blind, in which case they have to rely on it much more.
So two interesting things to go with that. So like crickets, for example. Crickets have bimodal neurons that have sort of peaks in two different frequency ranges for the same neuron. And each frequency range will elicit a completely different behavior to so you've got a peak at 6K and you've got a peak at 40K. And cricket, and this is the same neuron. Cricket hears 40K from a speaker, run over to it because that's got to be my bait or some, that, and you hear 40K and they run away. And, it's very predictive behavior. I spent a good period of time working with non-human primate species, marmosets. Marmosets are very interesting when you get to a more sophisticated neural system. But marmosets are very social. It's critical to their happiness. If you ever see a single marmoset in the zoo or something, that's a very unhappy animal. But they're native to the Amazon, New World monkeys, native to Brazil and the Amazon, but they're arboreal. They live in trees, and they're very social. So that kind of can, be in conflict with each other because you're, in dense foliage, but yet you need to communicate. So they've evolved very interesting systems to be able to, achieve what they needed to, which if you ever see marmosets, they're very stoic, unlike macaque monkeys that, often have a lot of visual, expression of how they're feeling. Marmosets always look about the same. And, but their vocalizations are almost like birdsong. And they're very rich in the information that they're, communicating. They also have a pheromonal system. Like, that you can have a dominant female in the colony who may not be, because you have to have ways of communicating. When one sense is compromised, the other senses sort of rise up to help assure that the success of what that system, that species or system needs is going to be, thrive. And in the case of marmosets, you can have the dominant female effectively causes the ovulation of, the biology to change of all the other females. And you can have a female that you put just in the same proximity, but now as part of a different group, and her biology will change. I mean, it's very powerful, the pheromonal interactions that happen because those are things that can travel even when I can't see you. One thing when I was working with them, that I thought was, and I like writing patents more than publishing papers. So, but these things are real because I was studying pupillometry. Is understanding the power of their saccades. I could know what they were hearing based on their eye movements, right? So if I play, marmosets have, some of their calls are really antiphonal. They're to see, hey, are you out there? Am I alone? Who else is
it's like
around?
texting for humans. Yeah.
And sometimes it's light, or sometimes it might be like, be careful. There's somebody, around that we got to watch out for. Maybe there's a leopard on the ground or something, right? And then sometimes it's like, you're in my face. Get out of here now, right? And those are three different things. And I can play that to you and I can tell you, without hearing it, and I know exactly what's being heard. In the case of the antiphonal, hey, are you out there? You see the eye will just start scanning back and forth, right? Because that's the right movement. I'm looking for, where's this coming from?
Yeah, they paired the right eye movement with the right sound.
Exactly. Yeah. In the case of, look, it's, there's something to be scared, threatened of. You're going to see dilation, and you're also going to see some scanning, but it's not as slow. It's a lot faster because there's a threat to me. My autonomic system and my cognitive system are reacting differently. And in the case of you're in my face, it's going to be, without seeing you, if I hear another, sort